Brother Sharan, for that introduction for tonight's lecture. Alhamdulillah, we are given good health and a good mind to follow this series of lectures on Islam and science. And last week, I started on the first part of the lecture on contemporary Muslim intellectuals and their response to modern science and technology. And tonight, I want to continue with the second part, where I will cover the ideas of Ziauddin Sada and Pervez Boy. Last week, I have spoken on the ideas of Syed Hussein Nas and Syed Najib Alatas, two famous contemporary Muslim thinkers and philosophers. And tonight, I will speak on another two different Muslim thinker. Both are originally from Pakistan, although Ziauddin Sada has now taken up residence in Britain. I think he's probably a British citizen by now, adopted the British nationality. But Pervez Boy, if I'm not mistaken, is still in Pakistan. And they both, they both took a different perspective from Syed Hussein Nas and Syed Najib. Yeah. Because if we remember what I said earlier about, or last week about the approach taken by Syed Hussein Nas and Syed Najib, they were very much metaphysical in nature. Yeah. Looking at Islamic philosophy, Islamic metaphysics, when assessing scientific knowledge. Yeah. It's mainly from a metaphysical and epistemological point of view in the analysis of science, and of obviously they privilege Islamic metaphysics, they privilege Islamic epistemology, and therefore both of them did not regard science as the highest form of human knowledge, or as knowledge that is capable of giving us knowledge of the ultimate reality and nature of the world. Yeah? Both, in a sense, regard scientific knowledge as occupying a lower level of knowledge as compared to Gnostic language knowledge, knowledge arrived through revelation or through mystical intuition and so on, which gives knowledge of reality in its fullest sense, in its more comprehensive sense, which is not limited to just the physical, yeah, but includes the spiritual as well. Whereas, as we know, science only deals with the physical and the material. And since a scientific method of experimentation, observation, rational thought, calculation, and so on, these sort of method are not capable of perceiving the realm of the non-physical, the realm of the spiritual, and so on. Therefore, for science, this realm simply does not exist, or that we have to remain agnostic about it. Yeah? But for Nas and also Najib, especially Nas, who considers himself a traditionalist, that kind of scientific approach towards reality is not admissible if one were to stick to Islamic view of reality, Islamic metaphysics, and so on, as to what constitutes the real ontology of the world, which is inclusive of both the physical and the spiritual. Whereas the scientific approach only admits of the physical while denying the reality of the spiritual. So it is this emphasis on metaphysics and epistemology that marks the analysis of science as given by Nas and Najib. Yeah? But Sada took a different approach. perhaps also because of his background. I mean, unlike Syed Hussein Nas and Syed Najib, who were very much into uh, Islamic mysticism, both in terms of scholarship and perhaps in terms of individual practice also. As we know, Nas has written articles on Islamic mysticism, on famous Sufi scholars and so on. Whereas, and Syed Najib also, I mean, sorry, not whereas, and Syed Najib also has written on mystics in the Malay Muslim world, such as Hamzah Fansuri and Nuruddin al-Raniri, and so on. And therefore are influenced by the Sufi metaphysics and Sufi notion of reality. Yeah? And this perspective is brought to bear when looking at scientific knowledge. Yeah? Whereas Sada does not share that kind of background. Yeah? Sada was educated in the West, in Britain especially. Um, and I think his field is something on information science or something along those lines, perhaps science-based also. Yeah? And I remember, I recall meeting Sada personally, actually, when I was a student in Britain. We were staying at Forces at the time, for the Forces building in, I think the place is called Kilburn in London. And Forces is the Federation of Student Islamic Societies in Britain. And there were a group of Muslim intellectuals who wanted to form a Muslim Social Science Association. And I attended the meeting, and Ziauddin Sada also was there. So Sada was very much into the intellectual life of the West at the time. Although he took an Islamic perspective of things, it was still within the Islamic framework, frame of mind and Islamic intellectual tradition. He did not abandon his Islamic roots, neither did he abandon the Islamic perspective in viewing intellectual issues, intellectual matters. So the fact that he was amongst this group of scholars who wanted to form this Muslim social science association, I think was an indication of his earnestness in retaining the Islamic perspective. And later on, he formed a group called the Ismaili group, yeah, together with a number of his friends. I think most of whom were also Pakistanis. Yeah? And having lived in the West and being in Britain in the this was in the 70s, the 1970s. I was a student then in Britain in 1970s. And the 1970s was a very interesting time, yeah, that period. One must remember that 1970s, chronologically, is after the 60s. Yeah? The 60s was the time the hippies and so on, and time when it was quite fashionable to be anti-establishment and so on, and against the prevailing current of thought at the time. Yeah? So this sort of feeling, this sort of mood of being anti-establishment and against the current intellectual climate of the time was quite prominent. You know, there's this kind of intellectual fashion of being against positivism, against modernism, and so on. It's quite fashionable in the 70s, I remember, and I suppose it coincided with the postmodernist movement, with the movement towards postmodernism, postmodernist epistemology, and so on. Yeah? And I was a student at Manchester University from 1974 to 1977. Yeah? And I studied, I took a major in liberal studies and science at Manchester University. And part of my studies, apart from taking a science course proper like physics. It was a sort of a double major. I took this physics, and also we had to study science, history and philosophy of science, and science studies and science policy and so on. And at that time, the intellectual atmosphere was quite interesting in Britain. It was highly charged. It was very active. Yeah? And even British intellectuals, yeah, Western intellectuals, were critical of science. Yeah, British as well as American. And at that time, the ruling orthodoxy in philosophy of science, Western philosophy of science, were the ideas of the logical positivists, and in Britain especially, that of Karl Popper. Yeah, and both the logical positivists and Karl Popper uh, were very much into science. I mean, they were supporting the modernist image of science. They were defending science at all costs and so on. But the new wave of thinking at the time, yeah, represented by, for example, Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend, both of whom were American scholars, American philosophers of science. That new kind of thinking, new way of thinking, was against science. Yeah, and I remember in Britain, there were also movements against science in terms of philosophy, in terms of sociology, and so on. And Jerome Ravetz was one of those figures in Britain, and I think he wrote a book on something on social construction of science or something. Yeah? And sorry, not social construction, the science and its social problems, something like that, yeah? Where he was critical of the scientific enterprise. So being critical of science in the 1970s was not something unusual. Yeah? And I also remembered another strand of thought, which was the Edinburgh School, represented by Barry Barnes and David Bloor, both of whom were in the Science Studies unit at the University of Edinburgh at the time. Yeah? And I remembered both David Bloor and Barry Barnes came down to Manchester University to give a talk, you know, on the sociology of science, and attended these lectures. So it was a very exciting time intellectually, yeah, to be in Britain in the 1970s. And I can understand from that point of view where Ziauddin Sada was coming from, because I was in the midst of that society at the time, the 1970s in Britain. And so it was a really in thing, and it was really hot to criticize science at the time. Yeah, to criticize science. Yeah? The notion of science as being rational knowledge, of being objective knowledge, as progressing towards the truth, the kind of scientific image which Karl Popper wanted to project and has been projecting in his books, that image was being seriously challenged in the 70s. Yeah? And Sada was familiar with his Western critiques of science by Western philosophers like Kuhn, Feyerabend, and as I've said, the Edinburgh School, David Bloor and Barry Barnes. So he was familiar with the criticisms of modern science by these Western critics of science. And I think he shared their sentiments too, right? Except that he wanted to retain his own Islamic roots and adopted the Islamic perspective towards science, and adopted an Islamic critique towards science. So in that sense, although he shared that sentiment and that attitude of being critical of modern science, as espoused by the Western critiques of science such as Kuhn, Feyerabend, and so on, he nevertheless made his criticism from an Islamic point of view. Yeah, and he was also into this notion of this movement of Islamization of science. Yeah, I think he had a book at the time. He wrote a book on arguments for Islamic science or something. If I'm not mistaken, he later on slightly changed or modified his position on Islamic science. Um, but at that time, he together with other Islamic thinkers were in favor of the notion of Islamization of knowledge, and to be more specific regarding science, Islamization of science. And as we know, the Islamization of knowledge movement actually began with the conference in 1977 in Mecca on Muslim education. And later on, they pick up the ideas of Ismail Farouqi, who wrote a book on Islamization of knowledge. Just a small booklet, I think. And of course, our own scholar, Said Najib, contested this claim that Farouqi was the one who initiated the idea of Islamization of knowledge. But let's not go into such a polemics. Yeah? Um, the notion of priority claims and so on. Who was the first who came up with this idea of Islamization of knowledge? But whoever it is, Ziauddin Sada was influenced by this idea. Yeah? And so he combines this idea, this intellectual current movement of thought within the Islamic world about Islamization of knowledge, and he combines this with the critiques of science prevalent in the West, and came up with his own Islamic perspective of science, which to me represented a sort of a synthesis of Western criticism of science and the Islamic perspective on science, which was, I thought, was an interesting attempt by Sada in introducing the dynamics of Islamic thought into the mainstream of Western intellectual discourse. And I think Sada has to be given credit for this, yeah? Despite attacks made by Said Hussein Nas and so on, in saying that, Sada is not a true scholar, is not deeply immersed in the intellectual scholarly tradition, unlike Nas himself, so on. But nevertheless, he addressed pertinent issues at the time and made a courageous effort in bringing in the Islamic perspective, despite the fact that he was not actually trained in Islamic studies. Yeah? So one has to give him credit, at least for making the attempt. And it's not an easy attempt. Okay, now, Sada's diagnosis of the ills of modern science, the problems created by modern science, is that it is a byproduct of a secular Western civilization. And in this sense, he was aware of the historical roots of science. So he was contextualizing science, just like how his other colleagues in the West, like Jerome Revetz and so on, contextualize science and therefore look at science from within a socio-cultural perspective, and not sort of regard it as some universal knowledge that exists in a vacuum. Instead, they contextualize science within a particular social and civilizational and cultural context, yeah? Which is the context of secular Western civilization. So in that sense, science is a product, or the scientific institution in the West is a product of its own times and its own environment, and therefore imbibe the values of that culture and civilization at that particular time. So in a sense, it's also provincial to some extent. Provincial in the sense that it is a product of a particular culture, which is that of Western civilization. Only that, the West regards, they do not really address themselves or as those who were living within the Western civilization, because they regard the Western civilization as universal. Yeah? So they don't see themselves in terms of Western civilization and so on, because to them, the term Western civilization itself is a restriction of their own universality. So there isn't this quite this awareness of things, Western and so on. It is we, from our perspective, who label them as Western civilization and so on. But they somehow assume that the rest of the world also adopt their view of things, and therefore they simply drop the label Western. But uh, Sada looks at it not from the point of view of the West, but from the point of view of Islam, and therefore uh, categorize them as being members of a Western civilization, and that science is part of this Western civilization and grew out of it historically. So it is not something which is timeless. I mean, unlike if you read the works of the American sociologist Robert K. Merton, who is a sociologist of science, he has this idea that the idea of the scientific ethos. And I think there were 4 values or something that constitutes the scientific ethos. Communalism, universalism, uh, organized skepticism, and disinterestedness, the 4 main values of science. And by having this notion of the scientific norms, Merton somehow or other makes it appear to be timeless and universal. But Sada, I think correctly, situates science within a particular social-cultural context, and therefore, in a sense, de-universalizes science. Yeah? And what's the significance of saying that science is located within a particular civilization, which is secular and Western? Well, the significance is that what it means is that that civilization has abandoned religion and religious values, yeah, in being secular. Yeah, secular by definition is something which has abandoned or dropped its religious values and religious notion of things. Yeah? So the upshot of saying that science is located within a secular Western civilization is that it will then make us more aware of the fact that that civilization, and therefore science by extension, has abandoned religion and religious values in the transition from a medieval society, medieval Western society or Christian society, to that of a modern Western society. Transition from medievalism to modernity involves the separation of science from religion, and involves science with as part of the movement towards a secular Western civilization. Yeah? And sorry, can we go back to the earlier slide? I was just reading the last line. Isn't it? Okay. And therefore, because of this change in the value system of science, yeah, in the transition from medievalism to modernity, the solution, therefore, is to be aware of this new set of values that is influencing science and that is causing all the problems, and therefore to replace those values with Islamic values. Okay, now we can move to the next slide. Okay. So again, going back to that idea, yeah, of contextualizing science in a particular socio-cultural context. Now, once we realize that science is located within a particular civilizational and social and cultural context, then we can begin to see that there is no such thing as value-free science. Yeah, because science is located within a particular cultural milieu, within a particular civilizational period, epoch. Yeah? So as what Spengler would say, it has, that any period has its own zeitgeist, has its own spirit of the times. Yeah, and even the notion of being value free is perhaps an expression of the zeitgeist of that particular culture at that particular time. So it's only relative. The values exist and then it's relative with time. And Sada, I think, was quite right to point out that there is no such thing as a value-free science, although that was what was projected early on. Yeah, uh, those uh, modernist philosophers, the logical positivists and Karl Popper and so on, who insist on the objectivity of science and the universality of science, they try to make it look as if science uh, is not influenced or not located within any value system. Yeah, and this is the work of the positivists initially, the logical positivists. Yeah, they make the distinction between fact and value. And the positivists have this grand agenda of uh, not only divorcing fact from values, but making science free of values, and science as simply something which is objective and factual. Yeah. So the contestation between the notion of science as being value free and science as being value laden, yeah, was something that took place in the 1970s. And so critics of science and later on the sociologists of knowledge and so on insist that we should not treat science as something which is something which is value free, something which is neutral, something which is not influenced by the socio-cultural uh, socio-cultural environment of the time, its values and so on. Yeah? And so for Sada, he adopted a similar attitude. He said that science and technology they are not value free, but they are infused with values adopted throughout Western history and civilization, such as the values of the Enlightenment, the values of capitalism, and so on. And these values, which are man-made in contrast to a divinely inspired value system, could not deliver man out of his ills. Yeah. And as we know, the secularization of Western society involves the generation of new ways of thinking, new philosophies, the Enlightenment philosophy and so on, the Enlightenment thinking and so on, beginning in the 18th century, which has replaced religious values and religious morality, and so on. Yeah? And the West regarded this as a sort of a progressive movement. Yeah? If you look at what Auguste Comte, for example, has to say about the evolution of human civilization, for him, you have the three stages, and religion represents the earlier and therefore the lower stage of human progress. The latest is the modern, the scientific, the positivist era. Yeah? And Sada disagrees with this characterization of science as being, value free and being progressive and so on, without any qualification, without being connected with any of our present social problems and ills and so on. Yeah? And in fact, science, as it is practiced within the secular system, has created problems, yeah, and has not brought about the kind of dream which Francis Bacon had of bringing about heaven on earth. The English philosopher Francis Bacon was one of those far-sighted thinkers in the 17th century who envisioned the idea and the ideal of science as bringing about what he called a kingdom of heaven on earth, as bringing about progress in human civilization and solving age-old human problems, like diseases, like poverty, like famine, and so on. Yeah? So Bacon, in fact, has written on this, yeah, where he believed that progress in modern science and technology can help improve human life, yeah, and change the human condition, yeah, and free humanity uh, of its predicament, of its struggle against nature, and so on. So much so that he's in a position to determine his own happiness on Earth. Yeah? And in that book called The New Atlantis, he put forward this vision. He said that he imagined that there is sort of a House of Solomon, which is basically a research institute where what we would now call R&D is done in order to solve all these problems that has bedeviled and beset humanity in the past. Yeah? For example, diseases. Yeah. So he imagined that there is one section of the House of Solomon where scientific studies is dedicated towards finding cures for human diseases. Yeah. Although, as I've said, Bacon sort of misjudged the situation, thinking that all human ills can be solved through this sort of approach, because now we are in the midst of this COVID crisis, COVID pandemic, and despite the advances in science and so on, uh, we are still back to square one. We are still uh, not that much more better than, let's say, 17th or 18th century as far as public health is concerned. So it has turned out to be eventually a mirage and an illusion. This idea that humanity will get out of its rut as represented in the past, in the Middle Ages and so on. Yeah? And all these things can be done by adopting the scientific approach towards life, not only towards the physical world, but towards the human social world. And this Baconian ideal of science and technology bringing about human happiness, in fact, is something which has been parroted by our present leaders. Yeah. Even until now, there is still this belief that eventually human problems can be solved through the adoption of modern science and technology. Yeah. And the ideal of development and so on is closely tied with this Baconian idea of science and technology as bringing about human progress and so on. Yeah? But as we can see, um, the application of science and technology in what Sada would call an unethical manner has brought about problems of pollution, industrial pollution, uh, the nuclear arms race, and so on. So science and technology is not without its downside. Yeah, and this is what the critics of science have been pointing out. Yeah? Okay. Now, Sada's argument and solution is that since science is not value-free, and that it somehow has to adopt or to be enveloped or to be situated within a society which has its own value system, and that science adopts the value system of that society, or that even science might have its own value system, as how Robert Merton puts it. Yeah? And that value system has not worked that well because of the problems that we have seen that has been linked to the way science is done, yeah, in the West. Yeah? And so, if the current value system within which science is located has presented problems, Sada's argument is that we should therefore consider replacing the value system within which science is embedded by a different set of values which is influenced by Islam, or which is derived from Islamic ethics and values. Yeah, and this is where Sadah's Islamic perspective and Islamic solution uh, distinguishes itself from the kind of approach taken by Western thinkers in their criticism of science. Yeah, Western thinkers, in criticizing science, in the modern lingo, in deconstructing science, did not replace it with something which is more positive. Yeah. So critique is not accompanied by constructive uh, cons constructive ideas on how science should be rebuilt. Yeah. But Sadar here, uh, despite his criticism of science, was still quite hopeful of science performing its uh, function for humanity through the adoption of the Islamic value system, yeah, and ethical principles. And he outlined several of these ethical principles, such as justice, conservation, balance, avoidance of wastage, etc., which are values which encouraged by Islam. Yeah. Avoidance of wastage, for example. And now we see attempts at recycling and so on. Recycling is very much linked to sustainable development and very much adopted in most societies. And that's a principle of, avoidance of wastage in Islam. The Malay word is jangan membazir, don't waste. Yeah? So it is part of Islamic values, not to waste, things. Yeah? And nowadays we see, recycling being very much an in thing, yeah? Where we conserve our resources through recycling. And so science and technology has to be practiced within a different value system. And here, Sadar suggests that that value system should be based on Islamic values and Islamic ethics. Yeah? Okay, and that should guide the workings of science. And Islamic values and Islamic ethics should be then the guiding principles in the practice of science and technology. And then we would have the Baconian dream of science serving humanity turning out to be a possible reality. Okay, can we move to the next slide? Now, in adopting this, what I would consider as a sort of a compromise approach, where despite being critical of science, he did not totally reject science, but suggested a redirection of science. That means redirecting science so that instead of serving the interests and being based on Western secular values and serving the interests of a secular Western civilization, it is now redirected. It is now put within a system, a value system that is Islamic in nature, that contains Islamic values and ethics, and which would see science not being abused, yeah, but utilized in a responsible manner. Yeah, science and technology and industrial activity being done in a way which is consonant with Islamic teachings and Islamic values. Yeah? For example, the approach towards the environment, the Islamic approach towards the environment, that the environment as a creation of God, the physical earth as a creation of God, must be respected and we must not act on it in such a way that we transgress the bounds that has been set by Allah. Yeah. So in so doing, we adopt what is now in the modern lingo called an eco-friendly approach towards the environment. And now sustainable development has become the mainstream, has become accepted world over. Yeah? And in a sense, that is quite consistent with the Islamic value system. Because in sustainable development, you do not practice wastage, you avoid wastage, you preserve the environment, you utilize resources such as minerals or whatever that the earth provides for us, but in a responsible way, in a responsible manner, so that we do not bring about environmental degradation and so on as a result of human greed for economic growth is simply exploit the environment. This Baconian ideal of, mastering nature, conquest of nature, those sort of metaphors that was used by philosophers like Bacon, which is quite against the Islamic attitude towards nature. Yeah. For the Muslims, it's not a question of conquest of nature, because as Khalifa, as God's vicegerent, we are not in the business of conquering nature. We are only in the business of carrying out God's commands as a trustee, as those who are carrying out amanah, God's trust, and what God has prescribed for us, yeah, on our behavior towards nature and so on. So this is something which has practical applications and practical implications, yeah, as far as adopting the Islamic approach towards science and technology is concerned. Yeah? So in this sense, the approach taken by Sada is quite different from the approach taken by Najib and Nas, yeah, because the approach taken by Najib and Nas in looking at modern science technology, because of its concern with metaphysical and epistemological issues, it does not bear any practical implications, yeah, or does not issue in any policy implications. So in other words, if you ask the question, well, if I follow Najib and Nas, how should I act with regard to modern science and technology? What sort of policies can I adopt in formulating the science and technology policy? Now, Nas and Najib, I don't think their metaphysics could provide direct answers to those sorts of questions. Whereas Sada's approach has those pragmatic implications. Yeah? So in a sense, it's quite helpful for Muslims who are action-oriented. They're especially amongst the younger generation. Yeah? They're quite impatient with the metaphysics of Najib and Nas and so on. What they're more interested in is, what can I do? What should I do? How can I act? How should I act as a Muslim with regards to modern science and technology, with regards to the natural world, with regards to economic and technological growth? Sure, yeah. So they want some practical prescriptions based on Islamic values. Yeah? And I think here Sada offers us a service, offers the Muslims a service, provides a service, at least from intellectual term, on how to think practically about these matters, yeah, and not be too steep in metaphysics and epistemology and so on. Although at one level that is also necessary, yeah? But I think one should go beyond the metaphysics and epistemology of Najib and Nas in tackling real problems concerning science and technology in its application to our daily lives, to technology, to economy, and so on. Yeah? Okay. Now, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay. I have to rush a bit because I only have about 10 to 15 minutes more left. Okay, now let's look at the other figure that I put on my list, the fourth of the four Muslim intellectuals that I want to discuss. And he is Pervez Woodboy. Now, Pervez Woodboy based his claim to fame based on his book, Science and Islam. Oh, sorry, Islam and Science. I have the book in front of me. I'm not sure whether it's can be shown on the screen because it's slides, but I'm holding it here now. Islam and Science, not Science and Islam. And unlike the three previous Muslim intellectuals that I've spoken about, unlike Najib, Nas, and even Ziauddin Sada, Woodboy stands out amongst these Muslim intellectuals in that he's not critical of science. He is very supportive of science. He is very much into modern science. Yeah? And instead, he would like to see the Muslims changing their attitude towards science so as to adopt the scientific approach towards study of nature and so on, which he regards as being progressive. Yeah? And for him, science should be autonomous from religion. There shouldn't be any religious control on science. Yeah, because for him, if there is religious interference and religious control over science, then science cannot develop and cannot progress. So, and he's aware of Western history as well. Yeah? The controversy between Galileo and the Roman Catholic Church. So he took that as his cue, that if religious institutions interfere with the work of scientists and with scientific growth, then science is going to suffer. Yeah, and for him, the problem with the Islamic world is not so much the threat posed by science in terms of epistemology, in terms of metaphysics and so on, in terms of belief basically. But for him, the real problem is Muslim backwardness in science and technology. Yeah, and some might even relate that to colonialism. The fact that Muslims are weak in science and technology made them vulnerable to attack by foreign forces, and therefore they were colonized. Yeah? So for Woodboy, he wants to awake us to the reality that, look, in the present world, the advanced countries are non-Muslim countries, yeah, and we are behind, yeah. So for him, the problem, as I put it on bullet 3, the problem is not that science is un-Islamic or against science in terms of metaphysics or epistemology, or that science is at odds with Islam in certain respects. The incompatibility perhaps in some areas regarding between science and religion in Islam. For him, that is not the real issue. Yeah? For him, the problem is the contemporary Muslim backwardness in science and technology in relation to the West and to other advanced countries such as Japan and South Korea. And in this, I think he resonates well with the ideas of contemporary Muslim leaders, political leaders, I mean, who insist on the catching up game that Muslim countries, Muslim societies must not be left behind. Yeah. So, I mean, even our own Malaysian leaders like Mahathir with this Wawasan 2020 and so on. Leaders like that couldn't care less about the metaphysics of Syed Hussein Nas or Syed Najib. Yeah. To them, what is important is that the Muslims catch up in their science and technology in relation to Western countries. So Woodboy adopts this sort of attitude towards science and technology. Yeah? So for him, Muslims should wake up. There should be a wake-up call instead of indulging in this critiques of science and so on from the perspective of Islamic ethics or Islamic metaphysics and so on. Instead of doing that sort of thing, we should be aware that we are behind in science and technology, and therefore do something to strengthen our science technology so that we won't be left behind compared to the other countries, other nations. Yeah? Okay, now can we move on to the next slide, please? And therefore, Hoodboy is also critical of contemporary Muslim attempts at the so-called Islamization of science. He sees this as a regressive movement, yeah, as something which brings us back one step backwards, or maybe more than one step backwards. Because for him, there is no such thing as Islamic science or Christian science or Buddhist science or Hindu science. Science to him is universal. Yeah? And any attempt to put science within the framework of any religious system or institution would retard the progress of science in that particular society or culture. Yeah? So in a sense, he's saying that it is self-defeating to engage in projects like Islamization of knowledge and so on, because what you're doing is to ignore the nature of scientific progress, the nature of scientific work, and how science is being developed, especially in Western countries now, and choosing to, and if you choose to separate science from mainstream science that is currently practiced in the West, and instead adopt your own parochial views by calling Islamization of science and so on. And he had his own, what I would say, unpleasant or bad experience in Pakistan, when there was this worldwide movement towards religious revivalism in the 80s, and Ziaul Haq was president of Pakistan, and Ziaul Haq encouraged, in fact, this sort of Islamization of science movements and so on, and the attempt to somehow relate religious beliefs with science. And Hoodboy was quite skeptical of this sort of things. Yeah? I mean, he pointed out some rather ludicrous statements made by some Pakistani Muslim scholars or scientists about, let's say, studying the phenomena of the jinn and so on in terms of theories of light and so on. And for Hoodboy, this is simply confused thinking. It's not clear scientific thinking. So Hoodboy would like to see a separation between science and Islam, so that science can develop properly, yeah, within a particular Islamic society. Although Hoodboy does not by any means reject Islam or Islamic values and so on, only that he thinks that the kind of approach we should take is the kind of rationalist approach taken by the Mu'tazilah, for example, in the past. So he did say that, he did acknowledge that science did flourish in medieval Islamic society, but he was quite insistent on the fact that the progress of science in medieval Islamic society was made possible not because of the presence of fundamentalists and orthodox Muslim theologians, but because of the presence of rationalist thought found in Mu'tazila ideology and so on. So he insisted on this rationalist approach towards knowledge, which he thinks has its precedent in in Mu'tazila ideology as exemplified in Khalifa al-Ma'mun and so on, who were Mu'tazilites in a sense. Yeah. And as put down here, point number 2, he was quite critical, even critical of attempt to sort of prove through means of modern science the truth of Quranic verses, yeah? Like what is done by Maurice Bucaille and so on the grounds that you should not tie down, Islam to science or vice versa. Yeah. And in this regard, he's critical not only of attempts at Islamizing science, but he's critical also of the ideas of individual thinkers like Ziauddin Sada, whom he thinks doesn't have a good definition of Islamic science, is not quite clear about what is program of Islamic science about. And as I put here, devoid of substance. And I think this is a statement made by Ahmad Dalal. And he was also critical of Said Hussein Nas, yeah? Who's, as written here, whose theologically defined science is a sure prescription for scientific decline. So in other words, he's critical of Ziauddin Sada and Said Hussein Nas on the grounds that he feels that their views of science and Islam would make the Muslims unable, yeah, to catch up with the advanced world in terms of science and technology. And he thinks that this is most unfortunate if it continues to happen. Muslims continue to lag in science and technology. Now, Hoodboy, of course, based some of his arguments on history, yeah, when he looked at the rise and decline of science in Islam. And his idea or his account of the rise and decline of science is, as Dalal describes it, a standard account. That means the account given by most historians of science. But Dalal was quite critical of the standard account of science. Yeah? And here are some examples given by Dalal. Yeah? For example, Dalal pointed out that Hoodboy was quite critical of Al-Ghazali, yeah, and Al-Ghazali's famous critique of philosophy, Greek philosophy, and so on, as being the cause, part of the cause of decline of science. But Dalal thinks that Hoodboy's arguments don't quite go through because, for example, in the case of the progress of science in the Islamic world, it continued despite Al-Ghazali's critique in the 11th century. Science continued to progress in the Muslim world till about the 14th or 15th century. So Dalal, Ahmad Dalal, who is a scholar of science and Islam also in America, was quite critical of some of the views of Hoodboy, especially his historical analysis, yeah, of the rise and decline of science in the Islamic world. And by extension, his attempt to bring that sort of analysis to contemporary science in contemporary Muslim world. Okay, can we move on to the final slide? No, just skip the slide because I think we're short of time. The conclusion, yeah, concluding remarks, okay. Okay, now, so my 2 lectures, which address the question of, or which gave an exposition of the ideas presented by the 4 contemporary Muslim intellectuals on science and technology. I have outlined some of the ideas, yeah, ideas of Said Hussein Nas, Said Najib Al-Attaf, Ziauddin Sada, and Prof. Boy. Yeah? And I have noted that the approach taken by Said Hussein Nas and Said Najib, is to look at contemporary science and technology from the point of view of Islamic philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. And although it is very relevant in looking at science in terms of Islamic beliefs and so on, and therefore help us to help to enlighten us on some of the issues concerning religious belief in relation to scientific knowledge and so on. It's helpful at that level, but when it comes to formulating practical and pragmatic policies on science and technology in the contemporary world, I think most are in agreement that the ideas of Nas and Najib has not got much to offer. Yeah, but then I suppose this issue of science and religion is not only, or should not only be looked at one level only, but multiple levels that this issue can be discussed. And so I don't think it is quite correct to sort of blame Nas and Najib for not having any practical policy advice to offer, because that is not their concern. And also science is multidimensional or has implications in different areas of life, in the areas of Aqidah, in the areas of social practice and so on. So although Nas and Najib might not have anything concrete to offer in terms of science policy, but at least they do address the question of belief, of Aqidah, and how to square that with contemporary scientific beliefs and the nature of scientific knowledge and so on. So I would insist that they also have done their part in this whole thing, in this whole exercise of looking at Islam and science. But on the other hand, I also think that one needs also to think in terms of practical policies and so on in the world of action, because nowadays we cannot avoid that. Yeah? In contemporary international competition at level of economics, at the level of technology and so on, we will just simply be left behind, if not trampled over, if we ignore those practical issues. Yeah? And here, I think the works of Ziauddin Sada and Prof. Woodboy at least have given us some idea on what areas we should be thinking on with regard to Islam and science. Yeah? And perhaps give some guidance on how to formulate an Islamic science and technology policy for the benefit, for the future benefit of the Ummah. And this is still, I would consider, a work in progress. Okay. And on that note, I end tonight's lecture. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullah, Prof. Next week, Prof will talk about Islam and contemporary philosophy of science, which is a more contemporary topic. And we have like 5 or 6 questions which are very relevant. I think I will forward all of this question to Prof immediately after this. So maybe you can respond in next week lecture, Prof. All of this question in more detail. I mean, without rushing to answer it.
I will start by dreaming the answers tonight when I sleep.
Because these are all good questions from Brother Alvin, Brother Nuruddin, Prof. Fatah, and this thing. Yeah, you need some thinking to delve with it, inshallah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Prof, for tonight. I think this discussion is very important and very deep. Any final word before we close, Prof?
I'm thankful that you all are able to follow me up to this lecture 7, and I hope I have set you all thinking along these lines, so that we can together formulate ideas which will be of benefit to the Muslim Ummah in future, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Prof. We look forward for next week's lecture. We have 2 more weeks, or maybe extend 3 more weeks with Prof. We hope Prof don't mind, so that we can finish it this lecture series in a I don't say in a proper manner, in a complete manner, not hanging, inshallah. Thank you so much, Prof. We'll see you next week. We'll see everyone next week. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.